This and every edition of Bang the Book Radio is presented by DSI Sportsbook. If you head on over to DSI, use that promo code BTB and the number 25, you get a $25 free bet just for signing up, a 100% deposit match bonus for the Sportsbook, and a 100% deposit match bonus for the live casino as well. At BetDSI, it's only a game until you bet it. First of two segments here today is the Westgate SuperContest Selection segment with myself and Sports Cheetah. Unfortunately, towards the end of the segment, had some of those audio issues again where Cheetah was cutting out a little bit. So he changed the way that he was connected to the show. You can hear that volume difference and maybe a little bit of a clarity difference as well there late in that segment. So I do apologize for that. But we talked about a lot of things with regards to the Super Contest here this weekend. Almost every line has a hook on it, so you won't have a lot of pushes available this week. You've got the Aaron Rodgers fallout. You've got the Jameis Winston situation where you don't know if he's going to play or not. So we talked about some game theory things. We talked about some matchups. And there's actually a game that Cheetah and I are on opposite sides for the Super Contest this week. So got a little bit of bragging rights on the line in that one. But I thought it was a really great segment. Again, don't let that audio problem detract from the segment because, look, there's so much great information there that a little bump in the road not going to do too much to take away from this segment. But without further ado, here is the Westgate Super Contest Selection segment for Week 7 with myself and Sports Cheetah. All right, I'm joined now by Sports Cheetah for our Week 7 Westgate Super Contest Selection segment. Sports Cheetah, of course, from WagerTalk.com. He's got his own entry in the Super Contest and a team entry in the Super Contest Gold. Cheetah, how's it going today, man?
I'm doing well. How are you doing?
Doing well. Appreciate your time as always here. As I like to do at the top of the segment, we'll run through some of the statistics from last week's Super Contest results. My entry, Bang the Book Podcast, 4-1. Now 17-13 on the season. Same thing for the BangTheBook.com podcast or BangTheBook.com entry, 17-13 on the year, 3-2 last week. Last 4 weeks, I'm 15-5. So I've dug out of that 2-8 hole that I dug myself early on in the season here. As far as the Super Contest results, 6,556 winners, 7,124 losers, 47.92% consensus 6-8. Top 5 consensus 2-3 on the season so far. 42, 46-2 for the consensus. One game with the same number of picks on both sides. Top 5 consensus 12-18. Overall in the Super Contest, 39,192 winners, 41,294 losers, 1,634 pushes, 48.69%. So Cheetah, those numbers from last week, it was kind of an interesting week overall in the NFL. Any of that surprise you?
Yeah, it was because we talked about all those double-digit favorites that I actually personally liked a couple of them, and then the dogs ended up covering a bunch. So I'm not surprised to see a lot of the majority of the consensus losing and the majority of the ATS records being below 500. The two I actually used were Redskins and Falcons, who were both up 17-0, and then just fell asleep anyway. So I went 3-2. So I guess I that's what I get for being quote unquote square public laying a favorite. But yeah, we were right there. I think you might have used the Falcons too, or at least you mentioned it on the show that you were considering them, and maybe that was your one loss. But I feel like that was one, or if they just didn't catch themselves falling asleep and then get beat by the Dolphins at home. It was such a weird game. So that one still kind of stings for some reason. And this week's definitely obviously a lot different. Not much in terms of big point spreads. You see like Dallas, San Francisco is around 6, and Minnesota, Baltimore's getting there. Green Bay used to be there, but that's about it. Everything else is pretty close.
In the Super Contest Gold last week, 234 winners, 226 losers, 50.87%. Consensus also went 6-8 there, but the top 5 consensus went 3-2. Top 5 consensus now 15-15 on the season in the Gold, but the consensus overall 49, 40-2, 51.75% success rate overall. So again, keeping that 3% edge over the traditional Super Contest. Cheetah, last week in the Super Contest Gold, 52% of the entries took the Pittsburgh Steelers. It was the top pick in both the Gold and the traditional consensus. Do you think we see a side get more than 52% in the Gold at any other point this year?
Yeah, it could be this week. It could be the Packers, not only just because the number was ridiculously high, and I've made a bet on the Packers myself, but it's also down to 3.5 at Pinnacle. And the contest number is 5.5, so I think you're going to have a lot of people using it just from the sake of it being a stale line. And on top of that, it's a pretty good spot to back Green Bay, I think, anyways, and a pretty big overreaction to the Aaron Rodgers stuff, which we can get into a little more later if you'd like. But I'm guessing, and I didn't know Pittsburgh was that used. We used them in our gold entry. I used them in my regular one as well. So I guess that's not too surprising. But if I was to pick a game this week that pushes that 52% number, it would be the Green Bay Packers.
One thing that we've been tracking here, the difference in consensus between the gold and the traditional super contest, those picks last week, 2-2. So now the gold side 20-14 when they have a consensus difference from the traditional. Let's go ahead and talk about that Packers game here. It's not on my card this week. I presume with what you just talked about in terms of the line value there, it'll probably make its way to yours. I get it. I understand why, obviously I understand why we saw such a significant adjustment from the Westgate number. Green Bay was a 6.5-point favorite. Rodgers goes out, reopens New Orleans -3.5. So you get a 10-point adjustment to Aaron Rodgers there. And then you had people piggybacking onto this thing. And one of the things that I talked about both over at BangTheBook.com and on the shows here throughout the week is that, what also contributed to this is that Green Bay looked like they'd be down 3 offensive linemen, starters no less, in Bulaga, Bakhtiari, and Taylor, which makes things much more difficult for Brett Hundley. So I think that was why we kind of saw that snowball effect of, this number continuing to go up.
Yeah, that was definitely part of it, and maybe why it came back down today finally. It was Bulaga and Bach they practiced in pads today and are good to go, supposedly. Kevin King and House are back as well. So they've had a ton of injuries, as people know, aside from Aaron Rodgers, which is kind of why it was impressive that he was getting them wins before, the collarbone injury. And I don't know. My number would have been 6 if he's playing. And, for me, no NFL quarterback's worth. I mean, at this point, it's still saying if that Westgate line was 6.5, I mean, it was when it got up to 6, it was implying like a 12.5-point swing from Aaron Rodgers. Mine's like 7. So, I mean, there's just so much value in the number. I have it under a field goal, and we're getting +6, +4, 4.5 is still around. It's down to 3.5 at Pinnacle. And it's not like it's a worse spot in the world. Assuming, the Saints, who absolutely crushed and scored, I guess it ended up being like 52 points against the Lions. And now you have a dome team that's going on the road to play Green Bay, who's going to step up in this first game for Brett Hundley, in my opinion. And by the way, on this show, we were talking about what I do during NFL preseason and setting up for season win totals, plays, and futures. And, people always ask me, and it was happening on Twitter, you mentioned it as well, because I had bet Dak Prescott Offensive Rookie of the Year before, and it was mostly just because I watched him in preseason. I was like, this guy's really, really good, and Romo has a back thing. Like, if he gets injured, 500 to 1 is a ridiculous price. And this year there wasn't anyone that stood out that was a rookie. But I don't know if you remember, on this show, coincidentally, I said the best quarterback I watched in preseason was Brett Hundley. And I said if Rodgers gets hurt or he misses time at some point this year, you're going to get a ton of value backing Hundley, because I think, by the way, Matt Flynn did it a few years ago. That guy's not even in the league anymore. Brett Hundley with a week to prep, with the full first team offense, with McCarthy's game planning for him specifically against a Saints defense that isn't very good, let's be honest. I love it. I think it's one of my biggest bets I've ever made in the NFL, actually. And I took +6 and I took 205 are the 2 money lines that I was able to get money down on 2 there. So they'll be in my card, obviously, but I'm afraid it'll be a kind of popular pick in the end. But it sets up really nicely. So the Packers, I still like it at +4.5 if you're able to snag that before people are listening. I know Friday morning 4s and 4.5s are still good. There's just a 1 3.5, so it looks like it's headed that way at least.
Yeah, that was the first thing I thought about when Aaron Rodgers went down, and it looked pretty much right away like it was something with the throwing shoulder or the collarbone, so it looked like he was going to be out for a significant amount of time. And that was the first thing I thought about was during the preseason when Cheetah said, I thought Brett Hundley looked really, really good. And I'm not surprised. I think the one thing that is unfortunate for you is that you probably would have been on the Packers at +4 in the Super Contest here, but because it's +5.5, now you're probably going to get a lot of gold picks on them. I don't know about the traditional Super Contest. I'm not sure you'll have a lot of people looking to back the Packers, even with the line value there. But you lost a little bit of equity, I think, because this number has crashed back down.
Yeah, no, it's a really good point. You may be right as far as the standard contest. No one's going to be looking to back Brett Hundley, and with Aaron Rodgers out, so that could be it. But then on the gold side, you have half the entries or more potentially using them. But it's absolutely true. As far as equity goes, technically to get the win, 5.5 is obviously a better number than 4. But if it's 4, maybe it's only 25% of the entries that use it instead of 50%. So the overall game theory-ness of the contest, I may have been better off, especially since I like them to cover 4 anyway. Just getting a lower number and betting the Packers or using the Packers in the contest for that reason. But it'll be an interesting game regardless. And, it's one that I think will tell people kind of, and I know a lot of Packers fans, and they talk about how Rodgers is the greatest, and he probably is right now, let's be honest. But they give McCarthy a lot of flack too, and they've had issues with offensive linemen. They've had receiver injuries the last couple seasons, just kind of piling up. They haven't really had a run game, and I'm really intrigued to see how McCarthy, because when he was doing it with Matt Flynn, it was very Belichick-esque with Russell going in there and being fine, and then obviously Tom Brady taking over for Bledsoe back in the day, and even who's the backup? I'm trying to remember who his name is. It starts with a G. I don't remember how to pronounce it, Guantabolo or whatever. The guy, the backup for the Patriots who's done so well. But then even last year, Jacoby Brissett, that's what I was trying to remember. He played a couple Pats games last season. I think started 1 or 2 of them. And the Pats covered both of them and I think won both of them. So it's very similar to where Belichick and McCarthy's offense at least has looked. And by the way, Matt Flynn did it against the Patriots when there was that 5-touchdown game everyone talks about that earned Matt Flynn that crazy contract from the Seahawks. It was against the Patriots. It ended up losing by 3. It comes down to the defense, and I expect them. They're healthier now, and I expect them to step up in this spot. Maybe not so much the week after that, but this is the week where I think they all just kind of rally together and get it done. So I like the Packers quite a bit, as you can tell.
Jimmy Garoppolo is the name that you were thinking of there.
Thank you.
So here's a question for you. So last week in the Super Contest, the Steelers were number 1, 36.5%. Green Bay was second, 35.5%. After that, you go to Detroit, 28.5%, Denver, 26%, Rams, 25.5%, Atlanta, 23.5%, Chargers, 22.5%, on down from there. Most selected side was the Arizona Cardinals at 20.5%. So I'm going to throw out a number here for you, and I don't know, this is completely unscientific as I'm just sort of looking at the pick counts from last week. It looks like, you'd pretty much be looking at about 19% of the contest field to have about 500 picks on the Packers. You feel like the number of Packers picks in the traditional Super Contest will be over or under 19%?
Oh, I think it'll be over for sure. Yeah, I imagine even in the traditional, it'll be over 19%. I actually use the Cardinals, so I mean, you're going off. I guess that was like the 10th most popular.
I'm just
used, but
I don't know. I'm trying to figure out. I mean, I don't know how square or how sharp the traditional Super Contest is. And yes, there's 2 points of line value there now, and I totally understand that. And I totally understand going after that in this contest. But I'm just kind of curious, what the 2,748 entrants are going to do with Brett Hundley as opposed to Aaron Rodgers. I mean, I don't know. It's fascinating to think about.
No, it's a fair point. I think you're definitely. I guess the question should be how big the discrepancy is from traditional to gold, because I think you're right in that a lot more gold entries will be using the Packers versus traditional. My guess is though it's still going to be over that 19% and be the most popular pick of the card, but I could be wrong. And so yeah, I'm intrigued now because you make a good point with that. Brett Hundley, it's hard to use him in a contest or just bet on him. Period. I mean, no one really knows the guy. I mean, there's no game. By the way, there's no game tape other than a couple preseason starts in that Minnesota, half or whatever that the Saints have, which I think benefits, the McCarthy game plan a ton as well. And he can run. I mean, Rodgers is very mobile himself. Big 3rd and 10 he picked up against Dallas that led to that instead of overtime winning on the road touchdown pass basically at the buzzer. I mean, Brett Hundley's be able to do a similar thing with his legs, and I don't know. It just screams out that they need to be used in every contest, and I'm betting them. But yeah, I guess 20% is maybe a pretty good over and under, or 19% is a good over under.
I mean, I don't know, because last week you had 49.5% of the traditional Super Contest entries on that Lions-Saints game, and the Lions were the number 3 consensus pick. So a decent chunk of people wanted to go against the Saints last week, even though it felt like the Saints were gaining a little bit of steam, and I was on them in the Super Contest as well. So another wrinkle into this is, I don't know how many people are going to take the Packers, but who wants to lay 5.5 with the Saints here in a game that was originally plus 6.5 if Rodgers is playing?
Yeah, and I guess the psychology of also losing backing a team 1 week or maybe 2 weeks in a row, and like, do you really bet against that team that just cost you a win the week prior, which would be the Saints in this case? So if there was that many, I didn't realize there was, maybe a third of the people who are using the Lions. I mean, that's a third of the people that maybe are afraid to bet against the Saints now this week because the Saints just trucked them. It got close, actually. It was a really strange game when it all was said and done. But, it's interesting to talk about. My guess, again, is the Packers is the most used. But you're kind of swaying me towards maybe overthinking that 52% mark. That might be too high.
I mean, in the gold, it's going to be taken a lot. In the traditional, your guess is as good as mine when it comes to that. I don't really know. What's interesting and kind of ironic here a little bit is that we may run into something of a similar situation in the Tampa Bay Buffalo game in that Jameis Winston's status still hasn't been declared. Number in the Super Contest is Bills minus 3.5. I know you and I were talking off the air a little bit about that in terms of, what you would do to the line, whether Winston plays or whether he doesn't. If it comes out that Jameis Winston's not playing, I'm kind of curious to see how many people flock to Buffalo in this spot. So, we talked about line value and stale numbers and the fact that, you get some of these wrinkles with some of these quarterback injuries or some of these other injuries. And we've got 2 games here on the board this week in the Super Contest that really illustrate the whole game theory element of this contest.
Yeah, I'm guessing most people stay away from this one for that reason alone. Most people have to turn in their actual entry by Friday night if they're using a proxy. And even if you get the extended version, it's till Saturday morning, basically. So you don't have like a ton of extra time because you're sleeping for most of it. And there's not a ton of movement, Friday night, Saturday morning. And there's usually not news on quarterbacks starting if they're going to be a game day decision. So for me, myself, I'm not going to bet the game just because there's too big of a question mark. If Winston was playing and was fine and passed all his tests or whatever, like 3.5 is too high. So I'd absolutely take plus 3.5. If he doesn't play, then I think, like we were saying, I think maybe it's about right, maybe a little short. So for me, it's a pass that's just so dependent on an injury, which most people, by the time they have to enter in their contest entry, it won't even be public news yet.
All right, one other thing to look at here overall in terms of the card, and this was something that struck me very early on here as the Super Contest numbers came out on Wednesday night. We've got 4 flat lines out there. 3 of them are +3, including the Thursday night game, which will already have been played by the time people listen to this show. But Raiders +3, Jets +3, Bears +3, Redskins +5. Everything else out there has a hook on it. So it's got the 0.5 on it. That's really interesting because, we talked about not wanting to give up games getting a push because it's so hard to make up any ground in this contest. Almost all hooks this week. So do you think that has any sort of impact on those games that are flat numbers?
It shouldn't have an impact on those. I don't know anyone, at least doing this semi-logically, looking to bet the flat numbers. So, especially if you're behind, which you need to make up the most ground, a flat potential push, you're just giving yourself that much less of a chance to win, especially when the flat numbers are like 2 threes, 3 threes with a Thursday night game. It's just so, it's not likely, but of the numbers it could land, 3 is the most likely. So you don't want to give up that potential half point. I used one a couple weeks back and it did land 3, and then I ended up costing myself a half point. Maybe if I used another game, it would have panned out. Maybe I saved myself a half point. I'm not sure. It was my 5th game out of 5 I had to pick. In this case, I'll be staying away because there's so many other options. I don't imagine I'll be betting Bears-Panthers or the Jets-Dolphins game. I kind of like the Raiders tonight, actually. Excuse me, the Chiefs. I was staring at the Raiders on my screen. I like the Chiefs, but I don't imagine I'll be playing it, and I'm waiting to see if there's a 2.5 that ends up popping later today to bet before kickoff. But other than that, there's so many half-point hooks on all these, and I think most people will be using the hooks if they're playing from behind, and hopefully some guys up at the top accidentally use, a Bears-Panthers 3 or a Raiders-Chiefs 3, and we get a couple pushes, and they lose out on a half or full point in some of those games. So we can only do our job from being in the middle of the pack, or I guess both of us are probably above average now, at least you are with your little run recently. So to make up, 4 or 5 points, you definitely can't give up a half point during a week. It's just such a big percentage of the points left, allotted.
Well, for those that are in the Super Contest, or maybe those that are following along, last year's winner, Pops, the Starbucks barista who wound up winning this thing and sort of kicking off that moneymaker effect in terms of the number of entries for the Super Contest, was just 16-14 going into this week. So, again, for those of you that are maybe in the middle of the pack and are listening to this segment, or those that are following along and are maybe in different contests or something like that, hey, 16-14, almost 500. And still wound up finding a way to win this thing. I think the leader last year, who was 23-6-1 or something like that, 24-5-1, one of the two. I'd have to pull it up here to double check, but finished somewhere around 500 in the contest. So lots of time left, a lot of picks left to be made, and I guess anything can happen at this point. So, hey, you're not completely out of it unless you've got some awful record here. But if you've kept your head above water, you're in pretty decent shape here. So, with that in mind, we'll go ahead and roll into Week 7 here, and we'll start with the games that I like, the ones that are probably going to make my play sheet here, and then I've got a few leans as well to discuss. And like I told Cheetah before the segment, I really don't like this card a whole lot because I think there are some very high-variance games and some high-variance teams here, whether they're catching points or giving points. It just seems like one of those weeks where there are a lot of teams I just feel like I can't trust. But we'll start with number 3 here on the Super Contest rotation order. That is the Tennessee Titans. They're on the road in Cleveland to take on the Cleveland Browns. Browns tickets right now going for less than $8 on StubHub for a sunny and 75 forecast, but that's not exactly the reason why I like this game. The reason why I like this game is because the Titans, in the 4 full games that Marcus Mariota has played, have at least 350 yards of offense. So even with the atrocious Matt Castle efforts, the really bad game against the Houston Texans, they're still plus 0.4 yards per play on the season. The ground game has been far more effective with Mariota on the field, and of course he can run a little bit as well. But what I really like here about this spot is that in watching the Browns, they play this high cover 2. The safeties are 15 to 20 yards off the ball for Greg Williams, and I just don't get it. Eric Decker's become a bigger weapon for Tennessee now. Delaney Walker is one of the best tight ends in the NFL. I just don't think that we see the Browns make that adjustment to bring the safeties closer to the line of scrimmage. Should lead to some chunk plays in the running game, should lead to some good gains across the middle of the field in the passing game. And I think going back to Deshaun Kaiser is the smart move for the Browns. I don't think that they ever should have sat him down. But I don't think that it really makes a significant difference. And it maybe concerns me a little bit more because I think he's a little bit more interception prone than Kevin Hogan, just because Kaiser's going to try to fit the ball into places where he probably can't. Kevin Hogan, I think, understands his skill set. So the Browns just don't have any wide receivers to exploit this Tennessee defense. Tennessee doesn't have a great defense, but, I don't think that the Browns can exploit what Tennessee fails to do. Titans only have 8 sacks, only 7 takeaways. The Browns don't have the personnel to make that hurt for Tennessee. And I think the Titans just control this game from start to finish, control the line of scrimmage, and cover this 5.5 number on the road.
This is actually the one game that I'm opposite or disagree with you on. And, it's not necessarily a massive play for me. I think there's a little bit of value as far as the numbers concerned. There's 6s here now in town that I'll likely be snagging up, and 5.5, offshore. I'll be waiting to see if that becomes more widely available before I release it. But I'll use them in the contest of 5.5. And it's not necessarily, you talked about, their safeties play back. Some might give up some chunk run plays, this and that, maybe some tight end seam routes. You probably don't know this or didn't realize that the best run defense in the NFL is the Cleveland Browns. They're awesome against the run, and that's generally what Tennessee likes to do with their duo tandem of Derrick Henry and DeMarco Murray. Cleveland's tied with Denver. They both give up 3 yards per carry, and then next best is third is Minnesota at 3.2 yards per carry. Considering the Titans are coming off a short week and Mariota's still nursing an injury, I thought he didn't look very good against the Colts, and it was pretty noticeable. They're going to be trying to run the ball. Cleveland's the best against the run so far. You have Kaiser getting his second shot at being the guy and to impress people, and I think Cleveland's going to be able to hang. As bad as Tennessee's defense is, and you made a point, Cleveland can't necessarily attack it to the extent that other teams can. It's still a game where I think Tennessee's strength is going to get crushed down because of how good Cleveland Browns run defense is, where even if the offense is average versus a bad defense, it's enough to at least keep this within, the 5.5 or 6 points. So I like Cleveland. Randomly play Tennessee really well the last 3 years. They've beat them twice, and then the one loss was by 1 point. So I think this is going to be their it's a chance at the Browns getting their first win, and they probably are talking that up, whereas, in future weeks are going to have lesser opportunities to get a win against a lesser team that's, nursing injury that they match up really well against. So I like the Browns, and I don't know if I talked you out of Tennessee or not, but I'll be using them in the contest for sure at +5.5.
You haven't talked me out of them. It's certainly a decent thing, though, for us to disagree here on some of these games and kind of give a wide range of perspectives on them. I'll say this about the Browns' run defense. I did write that down in my notes. I mean, Joe Schobert's been very good at stopping the run. Their linebackers, Christian Kirksey, they do a very good job coming up and run support. They do have some defensive line injuries. Danny Shelton's banged up. Jamie Meter's banged up. So they do have some guys that, at that first line of defense there that may be a little bit hobbled, may not be able to play, tap into their depth a little bit. But I will say this. The Browns do have a good run defense statistically, and I give them a lot of credit for that. But they're 20th in rushing attempts against, and they've been behind in pretty much every game that they've played this year. So teams haven't really tried to force the run because the Browns have just been so easy to throw against. So I'm kind of curious to see what happens when they do play a team that is predominantly run first, that is run heavy, to see if they are able to stack up in that regard. And of course, too, I think Mariota's got enough to run some play action stuff here, get those safeties frozen in coverage. Jabril Peppers looks terrible in coverage, by the way. I just think schematically, unless the linebackers have a really big game, and they have so far, so I have to consider that. But I think schematically, this is a spot where I just don't know if the Browns can keep those short throws contained, can get up there and make plays against a very good offensive line. It's probably the best offensive line that Cleveland's seen this year. So I like the Titans, and also, too, the Browns have to score some points to cover this number, I think, and I just don't know if they're going to be able to do that against any defense, especially one that has a chip on its shoulder here and has a chance to actually go out there and play well.
Yeah, you'd think so. Against the pass, they're tied for 26th, but they're tied with teams like Kansas City, Oakland. That's why, you wouldn't think Kansas City's that bad against the pass. So it depends. If I'm the Titans, I do a lot of play action. I try to get them, playing for the run and beat them on the outside or over the middle where you can through the air. Can Marcus Mariota make throws? Sure, he can. The one thing that does benefit him, if he's nursing an injury that's hurting him, they're probably not going to run with Mariota a bunch, which limits a lot of why they're valuable running a ball in some read option spots or just him making plays, whether he's dropping out back to pass and just running with his feet. So I think Tennessee's offense is just so limited now with Mariota hurt. And I think Cleveland can score enough against Tennessee when it comes down to it, with Kaiser and his I guess, second hurrah here is trying to earn the starting spot. And I think he came out in week 1 and was pretty solid. And, maybe it's a similar feel for him where he knows he's getting a chance. And, it's a second chance, which sometimes you don't get in the NFL. And so he plays for the Browns. He doesn't have a ton of weapons around him. I understand that. But I think he'll be able to figure it out. And when it comes down to it, Tennessee's, they're average defensively, both against the run, against the pass. It's nothing like, impossible for the Browns and Kaiser to figure out here at home in the game that they honestly to get a win on the board. I think this is one of their more winnable games here left on the schedule. So we'll disagree. I'm going to use Browns for sure. It looks like you're going to be using Titans, and we'll see. I'm curious to see now also where the splits are consensus wise, in the contest and stuff outside of just our two entries.
So what's more important for you, bragging rights here on the show or the point in the Super Contest?
Oh, I just the Super Contest point. I have a pretty good start, and I do so many shows and make so many predictions. I'm wrong so often that I'm used to it now, and if I'm right, that's great. But I'd rather have the point. So don't worry, we don't need to put anything on this unless you want to do like lunch, dinner, bed, or something. We can.
We'll figure it out. We'll figure something out off the air, and then maybe let our listeners know with our Hunting for Winners segment on Tuesday. We'll move on from that game here. We'll go to game number 8 in the Super Contest rotation order. I like this one a decent amount. That's the Cincinnati Bengals. They're plus 5.5 here against the Pittsburgh Steelers. Bengals coming off the bye. And what I really like here is that offensively, since Bill Lazor took over, they've been much better. 24, 31, and 20 points since he took over. But what I really like is that Joe Mixon's gotten over 55 touches here combined in the last 3 weeks. And that really helps this team out because they're giving the ball to the guys that can actually make plays. Andy Dalton, since Bill Lazor took over, 68 of 93 for 826, 7-2 touchdown to interception ratio. We know the defense is very, very good for the Bengals, bordering on elite. You're getting 5.5 with a total in the low 40s. Also, the Bengals plus 0.9 yards per play. They're -7 in turnover margin, though. So, I think Cincinnati is one of those teams that should be on the rise here. You got a Pittsburgh team, coming off of a very big emotional win against Kansas City. Now they're coming back home, playing a late kickoff at home as well, which is something that they're not used to there at Heinz Field. I thought this number opened a little bit high. I think it was a little bit inflated with both the Pittsburgh team and their win last week, and I still think at 5.5 in the Super Contest, it's a little bit too high.
You know what? I actually think the number's pretty good, and I won't be using this game on my card at all. I can't disagree with any of the points you made. I do wonder. That Jacksonville game was so weird, and they threw a bunch of interceptions. Jacksonville scored on 2 of them on pick sixes. They had a 90-yard run at the buzzer, basically. It didn't even matter. And 21 of the 30 points Jacksonville scored, were on defense or the breakaway from Leonard Fournette at the end of the game. Pittsburgh's defense has been really, really solid. Ben woke up, and this is kind of it was off a Baltimore Ravens win, too, on the road, which is big for Pittsburgh, obviously, in that rivalry. So I thought it was just such a great spot to back them against KC. And if they had lost to KC or even not even covered or wasn't even close, then I think the warning signs of there's something wrong with the Steelers team go. But they dominated Kansas City in the game. I think Kansas City didn't gain a first down in the first half and maybe until the last drive. And, it was 1 first down and then it went into the half. They just have been so good on defense. You look at the game a little further when it comes down to it. Cincinnati's had the best, opponent yards per play in the NFL so far. Pittsburgh third, and they're both number 1 in tied for number 1 against the pass, opponent yards per pass attempt. And so I looked at betting under 41. It's moved to 40.5 some spots, but that's probably my favorite play in the game when it comes down to it. Rather than betting the side in case, and kind of why I was bringing up all that backstory for the Steelers, if KC, like they were supposed to, won the game on the road, played it really well. From start to finish, I thought they were the better team. And, if they're here now, and Cincinnati's obviously a little less talented just when it comes down to it, power ratings wise or just eye test wise, they just don't have as much. And I think the number's about right. So for me, I'd be worried that Pittsburgh's kind of really going to start get rolling here. Le'Veon Bell looked a lot better, and he's kind of just had such a slow start to the season. So I'm worried about this side either direction, and I'd just look for under, if anything, at 41.
I think it's fair. I mean, it certainly didn't bother me like the under. I'm getting 5.5 points here in a game that, the total may end up closing 39.5, 39, something like that. It's right around 40.5. So, I don't mind that. If I'm getting points in a game that's projected to be very low scoring, that's something I do like. And I do like Cincinnati coming off the bye with a new offensive coordinator who had to take over a couple weeks into the season because I feel like, he can add a little bit more of his own personal touches to the playbook. Like I said, he's getting Mixon more involved, which is something that Zampese wasn't doing at the outset. Dalton feels more comfortable. I mean, this was Dalton's quarterback's coach who took over as the offensive coordinator. So I think when you give them a little bit of extra practice time, Marvin Lewis kind of rewarded them a little bit, gave them a few days off on the bye week. I just think the Bengals are, from an emotional and mental standpoint, in a pretty decent spot here. And of course, too, when you look at a lot of these AFC rivalry games, and I talked about this on Thursday with Brad Powers, you look at the Bengals, Steelers, Ravens, Bengals, Ravens. A lot of times these are tight, low-scoring affairs. Usually it's like a pick six or something like that that'll take the game out of single-digit range. As long as I avoid one of those here with Cincinnati, and of course with Dalton, that's always a possibility. I just think that there's a little bit of line value here with the way that this game's shaking out.
It's true. I mean, it's kind of one of those things that, like, the true number models guys would, you can't quantify how much a rivalry makes a game close as far as the final score goes. But, especially it seems like Baltimore-Pittsburgh, without fail, it's coming down to a field goal that either is tying, winning by 1 or 2, whatever. So I can't disagree there. I mean, somehow a lot of these rivalry games just end up, interdivision rivals end up close. So getting 5.5, obviously better in that case than laying the 5.5.
All right, we'll move on to the next game here. All we have to do here is slide down one spot to look at number 9, the Minnesota Vikings. They're a 5.5-point favorite against the Baltimore Ravens. I'm a little bit surprised that I've got a couple of chalky plays here at the 5.5. But, I think in this spot here, I just think Minnesota is set up really nicely for a game like this. Baltimore's beaten the Bengals in week 1, the Browns in week 2. They forced 10 combined turnovers in those first 2 games. And their other win over the Raiders with E.J. Manuel. With how good this defense is, Baltimore's still minus a half yard per play. Rush defense has struggled. They've only allowed a 53.6% completion percentage. But what I like about that for Minnesota is that Pat Shurmur offense, there are a lot of high percentage throws, lots of short throws, checkdowns, swing passes, stuff like that. And the Ravens, when they have allowed a catch, have allowed 12.7 yards per reception. So maybe they're having some problems tackling in space. Maybe they're having some issues defending sideline to sideline. Well, that's what Minnesota wants to do. They want to put you in space. They want to move the pocket. They want to swing things around a little bit. So I think that Minnesota matches up really well here schematically in this game. Also, another thing that I like, former Cincinnati defensive coordinator Mike Zimmer, he's game planned a lot for Joe Flacco. He's game planned a lot for John Harbaugh, knows what Flacco's skill set is, knows what Harbaugh wants to do. I know there's been some turnover with the offensive coordinator and the defensive coordinator and that type of thing. But Zimmer has a lot of familiarity with this Baltimore team. And Baltimore, they're just a bad offensive team. I think it's 4.5 yards per play. They're 24th in points scored with the 3rd best average starting field position. I don't trust Joe Flacco at all whatsoever. And if he starts taking some shots here in this game, which Minnesota can certainly do, I think that really affects him in a negative way. So I like Minnesota here. I know I'm laying 5.5 with a total in the high 30s, but I just don't see Baltimore doing a whole lot offensively. And I think Minnesota's game plan on offense is actually a pretty good fit in terms of going against the Ravens.
Yeah, I don't disagree with you at all in this game, and I'll likely be using Minnesota. Under 6, I think it's going to be good. It's going to get to 6 or 6.5, I think, in the real market by kickoff. And, I mean, you mentioned Baltimore's struggles offensively and how they kind of just ran good to get a couple wins early in the season. I mean, 4.5 yards per play, 30th in the NFL. Only Buffalo and Miami are worse, and Buffalo's 0.01 yards per play less. It's basically tied for 30th with them. I can't disagree. I mentioned before, outside of defenses in the NFL, I'll pull it up, but Minnesota was 3rd behind. It was Denver and Cleveland. And so, Baltimore is one of those things where they don't like it when Flacco has to throw a bunch, so they try to get the run game going. It's going to be hard to do that in Minnesota against the Minnesota rush defense. So like you mentioned, Flacco's kind of plays into what their is where we take away the run and we make you beat us through the air, which is hard to do anyways. And, I think I hadn't made the connection yet with Zimmer and having prepped for Flacco before with Cincinnati and stuff. And I think it's a nice spot. And, I think Case Keenum's done a great job himself. I don't think they're going to rush Sam Bradford back. I'd like it less if Bradford was going, similar to the other night when they played. I don't know, it was 2 weeks ago now, 2 games ago, when he played for about a quarter and a half. They put Keenum back in, and Minnesota woke up. So I like Keenum. I like Minnesota here. Under the 6 is a good bet, I think.
All right, so we had Cheetah call back in there. I know he was cutting out a little bit, and we're trying a different connection here, see if that works a little bit better. But as far as Week 7 goes here, I'm looking at the Titans, the Bengals, and the Vikings as the 3 plays that I probably like the most here. And, of course, there is a disagreement between Cheetah and I on the Titans. So, like I said, bragging rights and maybe a point in the Super Contest on the line there in that game. We'll look at my leans list here, and this is really tough for me, Cheetah, because as I talked about earlier in the segment, a lot of teams I just feel like I can't trust here this week. And, one of them is on my leans list, but this is more of a situational play than anything else. That's the Indianapolis Colts plus 3.5 here. The Jaguars back on the road, laying a number on the road. Leonard Fournette didn't practice Wednesday, didn't practice Thursday. Says he's going to go on Sunday. We'll see if that is the case. But I think you got a little bit of a look-ahead factor here for Jacksonville because they've got the bye coming up next week. They played in London, played at the Jets, played at Pittsburgh, hosted the Rams last week. They were the better team but lost that game. Now they're back out on the road. Situationally, I feel like Indianapolis is a good look. I just don't know if I love them from an X's and O's standpoint.
Yeah, it's hard to like them from an X's and O's standpoint, just at all. It's basically this, and I did it a couple weeks ago when Jacksonville was laying points on the road against the Jets. And you have to do it again here, I think. You just have to use the Colts. at 3.5, especially if we get in the hook, which I believe I closed my tab for the contest. I believe you are getting 3.5 for this particular game. So in the market, it's a juiced 3. There's like 3.5, I think, at CG here in town. I think you have to use the Colts, especially if there's really only 3 you like, and there's just a rule of thumb at this point. I mean, not only just Jacksonville as a favorite, but a road favorite. They just never get it done over the last few years. They just haven't been able to do it. They didn't do it this year when they were a favorite at the Jets. They're getting 79% of the public action split. If you care about those numbers, I just think that's an incredibly high number for the Jaguars. Colts short week, I guess, hurts them a little bit. My number, though, is 3.5 exactly, so it's one of those where I don't think there's really a big edge. From a number standpoint, you're just basically betting on the Jaguars' capability of performing on the road, and let alone, as an underdog, but as a favorite of over a field goal. And the Fournette thing's interesting. He did this a lot in college at LSU, where he'd just sit out, practice, and then go play. And sometimes he wouldn't play, and sometimes he would. The fact they have a bye, I'm guessing they're fine using him and seeing how he responds during the game. And then if he needs to come out, they can, and then he has another week to rest. So I imagine he's playing just for the sake that he's questionable, and they have a bye afterwards. I think that benefits him. If they had a string of 3 or 4 games, maybe they would just sit him this one and start him the next week. But the fact they have a bye coming up, I imagine he'll play. So I don't think, we could luck into a no Fournette Jacksonville team, but I doubt it.
Another game that's on my leans list here, and the reason, from a numbers standpoint and from what we've seen from the body of work of both of these teams, it kind of makes sense to take the San Francisco 49ers, number 22, at plus 6.5, but man, is this spot so bad for them. Last week, when you look at Washington, I think Washington was a justifiable double-digit favorite to take in the Super Contest because the spot was so bad for San Francisco. Got off to a bad start, played very well in the second half. Beathard came in, looked a lot better with the offense, and kind of gave San Francisco some hope there. Now they go all the way back home. Cowboys team off of a bye. I like the 49ers. I like the fact that they're playing a lot of close games here. They've been very competitive. I love Kyle Shanahan, but I don't know if I can do it here.
Yeah, this one's tough, and honestly, and I mentioned earlier the Redskins was the other favorite that I used, and I bet them. I got -10 actually, just in real life. That was one of my only bets last week, and I like the Redskins a lot. I think there were 2 safeties that were starting for the 49ers at linebacker. One is a converted safety to linebacker just because they're so injured. The other was a scout team safety linebacker kind of utility guy, and then he was the one calling the plays. They just had so many backups going anyway. It was 17-0, and it looked like the Redskins were just going to run away with it. And then they put in C.J. Beathard out of, I believe, Iowa, and their offense just somehow all of a sudden clicked. He's kind of just this gritty gamer guy, the classic prototypical, not very good at anything, but doesn't really make mistakes and just finds ways somehow to make plays. And so it's fun, I guess. It'll be fun to watch him in this particular game. I guess the Dallas team off of buying off that, basically last second loss to the Green Bay Packers at home. The Zeke Elliott stuff's kind of weird. That's probably why I end up staying off the game. Ultimately, for me, the number's a little bit too high, but I'm not sure, if they were anticipating when this opened 6 if Elliott was going to play or not. And then the news earlier this week is that he got that thing passed again, if I recall correctly, or I guess postponed at least. And so he's not going to be sitting the next 6 games, which was originally anticipated that he would. And then the Cowboys were probably prepping that he was going to miss, and now he's back again, kind of like at the start of the year. It's just strange, extracurricular stuff going on in Dallas. So, that makes me lean a little more towards the San Francisco side, especially if, the numbers, at 6.5 in the contest is an extra hook on the market, which is 6 flat just about. So I'm with you. It's same with the Colts. It's one of those that's really ugly, really tough, won't be a popular pick, but it's definitely the dog or nothing in this one too.
All right, so this is one I talked about on Thursday's show. I said I didn't want to ruin my analysis on the Falcons-Patriots. I wanted to save it for the Super Contest segment here. On my leans list is the New England Patriots -3.5. I know this is a very contrarian play to look at. I know the line has moved from 4.5 to 3. I know it's the Super Bowl rematch and all that type of stuff. But there are a few things I do like here about New England. One of them is that Matt Ryan has regressed this year. I don't know if people realize how much he has regressed, but last year with Kyle Shanahan, career high 69.9% completion percentage, career high 38 touchdowns, career low 7 interceptions, 13.3 yards per completion was a career high. This year with Steve Sarkisian as the offensive coordinator, 65.9% completion percentage, so that's down 4%. 6-6 touchdown to interception ratio. So he's almost thrown as many picks this year as he threw all of last year in the regular season. He misses Kyle Shanahan, man. I mean, that guy, his play design is brilliant. He's very good at getting guys open. Matt Ryan can hit guys that are open. So, Matt Ryan's numbers pre-Shanahan were pretty good. They weren't as great as last year. And he's kind of regressing back to that guy that he was. So, look, I know people love the Falcons. I know they love their yards per play disparity. But something about this game just feels off to me. This mob mentality to fade Tom Brady and Bill Belichick in a primetime game, I mean, it's something that we really haven't seen a whole lot. And for some reason, I just think going up against a new offensive coordinator and a new defensive coordinator for the Falcons, that Brady and Belichick are going to do what they do best here in this spot.
Yeah, I agree. And speaking of Kyle Shanahan, I mean, we didn't mention with the Niners, who he's now the head coach, calling plays for them there. They've lost, their 5 losses are by a combined 12 points or something, which is the all-time record for 5 losses by the least amount of points to start the season. So just another side note for the Niners there. I agree here, and we were talking about, this is one we did talk about for a second before we hit record, and it's crazy to me how many people are, I mean, Falcons fans, I get it, you want the revenge from that absolute choke of the Super Bowl to the Patriots. Sure, I guess. I mean, the number technically is fine. It got that down from 4.5 to 3 now at Chris and Penny for less than -120. 86% of the bets so far on the Falcons side. That's just not the Patriots team. It's generally a public side. Granted, they haven't been as good defensively. They're one of the worst defenses still. I get it. But this one for me, I agree. It's Pats or nothing. I was telling you, I mean, I don't know if I'll end up using it because it is 3.5 in the contest. But if this becomes, 3, maybe I doubt it gets to 2.5. But I'd probably end up betting this as far as the Patriots go with my real money, and maybe pick a different game where I don't have to lay 3.5 on the Patriots like in the contest.
And to me, this looks like one of those game theory spots where if I want to take New England at 3.5 when the market is 3, I mean, I don't think there's going to be a whole lot of people on New England here in this spot. I think it's going to be a lot of Atlanta picks, especially in the traditional super contest where, I think people are just going to look at what we've seen on the surface this year from both of these teams and not really think about the fact that, I mean, this is almost unprecedented to see this much steam against New England in the Brady Belichick era. I shouldn't even say almost. It probably is unprecedented. And like I said, I get it. Atlanta, 6.2 yards per play, 4.2 yards allowed per play. I get it. Statistically, they've been dominant. But they only have, 3 takeaways, I think, this year, or 7? They have 3 takeaways and only 12 sacks. So if you're not taking the ball away from Tom Brady, guess what Tom Brady is going to do? He's going to score points. And I don't know how many points the Patriots can keep Atlanta to, but, man, when I see something like this, and when you think about the NFL and wanting to zig when other people are zagging and all that, it just looks like New England for me. And maybe I'm wrong. Maybe Atlanta blows New England out on the road. I don't know. But I think this is one that, from a game theory standpoint, and based on what I've talked about here, I think I almost kind of have to do it.
Yeah, I don't disagree. I think I mentioned to you too before when we were talking. It feels like one of those where you could bet Atlanta scores first or something, or wait to bet New England maybe in game because Atlanta will have maybe that extra emotion. If they win the toss, they'll want the ball first. They'll want to score and just get the momentum going. And so New England down 7 maybe turns into a game where it's more like pick. And, there's probably some Atlanta scores first props out there that'll be plus money. Worth looking into those, but I agree when it comes down to it, 60-minute game, just like we saw in the Super Bowl, the Patriots probably are the better team still, and they're at home. And as bad as their defense has been, it's improved the last 2 weeks, so maybe they're at least figuring something out there. And I'm not sure how much Atlanta can really beat them against the run. So, the Patriots kind of just sell out to the pass, which is weird because usually you say a team sells out to the run, but if they can sell out to just stopping Matt Ryan, not letting him just distribute around the field through the air, then I think they're going to have a chance. And like you said, in the end, the Patriots are going to score too. So they're going to move the ball against Atlanta. The total is really high. It's moved from 53.5 to 56.5. So people are not only betting Atlanta, but they're slamming the over too.
One other game that's on my leans list, and I don't think that I can play this one, but I did want to touch on it here. Monday Night Football between Washington and Philadelphia. I like the Redskins +5, but with the state of their secondary, with Rashad Breeland out, probably. I heard he sprained his MCL last week. Josh Norman may not play. DeShazer Everett may not play. Really hard to take them against Carson Wentz with the way that he's running this Philadelphia offense. But statistically, the Redskins +0.7 yards per play. The Eagles just +0.2 yards per play. Both of these teams pretty fresh. The Redskins off a bye, and then that game against San Francisco. Eagles with some extra prep time. But sometimes I think if you go from Thursday to Monday, that can be a little bit of a detriment to a team because you get into that rhythm. You're used to playing. You know the Thursday night game happens. It's a thing. But then you're ready to play again the following Sunday. Well, here it's the following Monday. So I wonder if maybe that does throw Philadelphia out of whack a little bit. I like the Redskins. If their secondary was healthy and this number was still the same, they would have been in my picks list instead of on my leans list. But, for now, I mean, unless I get some concrete evidence about that secondary, it'll probably just remain an unused lean.
Yeah, I agree. I had planned on backing the Redskins, actually. Just kind of circled it ahead of time last week. And we're going to find out, obviously, if Carson Wentz and Philadelphia Eagles are for real. So far, they've looked it, so you have to give them credit. But if they're going against a bunch of backups in the secondary, Washington can try their best to score with, the Eagles' offense, but I just don't see it. On the road, Kirk Cousins' splits are pretty bad, too. Not that that's necessarily, something to bet on or against regularly, but it's just worth noting when he is on the road here against a solid defense like the Eagles. So I'm with you. I'm passing for sure, but I had hoped that we'd get – actually had hoped for a little higher number, too. At this point, I thought the Eagles maybe would be, valued high enough or at least perceived to be high enough where we get a 6. But I don't envision that, and it doesn't look like that's the case now, and especially if, the Redskins are hurting, and then they end up, playing some of those guys in the secondary, then the number's not going to go up. So, it's a tough one. I'm probably going to end up passing myself.
Well, Cheetah, I think we went over a lot of good things. Unfortunate that we had the audio problems again here this week, but, we'll see if we can shore those up a little bit for Tuesday. But, man, thank you so much for joining me again. I appreciate your analysis as always, and good luck with your cards this week.
Yeah, absolutely. Take it easy.